On May 5, 2005, the nation marked the passing of an era. After a full life of 91 years, death had finally silenced Luis Taruc, or popularly known as Ka Luis. This documentary film is a testament of his life in his own words. For when he was alive, his was a voice that could not be silenced.
Salamat ng marami.
Nais po namin magpasalamat at hinayaan po ninyo kaming maging kabahagi sa paglilibing ng Ka Luis Taruc.
Ikaw ay umauna, ikaw ay lubusan ng nakikiisa sa kamatayan ni Jesus. Kasang-ayon sa kanyang pangako, magtatamasa ka ng kanyang maligayang pagkabuhay sa kanyang piling magpasawalang hanggan. At alam na ninyo ang daan patungo sa pupuntahan ko. Sinabi sa kanya ni Tomas, Panginoon, hindi po namin alam kung saan kayo pupunta. Paano namin malalaman ang daan? Sumagot si Jesus, Ako ang daan, ang katotohanan at ang buhay. Walang makapupunta sa Ama, kundi sa pamamagitan ko.
Kapag binagit mo revolusyon, maraming natatakot. Pero ang revolusyon, dalawangan nyo. Isang baligo, patayan. Sabi ko kay Jambi Abad Santos Madrigal, yung mga gwardiya ninyong yan, mataas na pader na yan, walang kwenta yan sa mga mahirap kapag takas silang nagalsa. Pati kayong mababait na mayaman, pati si Kayiting, pagkakamala yan. Nagpabaya kayo sa inyong panahon, kasama kayo sa aming lilipulin.
One problem is, now 70% of our people, magsasaka farmers. You import rice, that rice comes in debt na naman. Paano kung wala na magpahutang? Saan tayo? Isipin mo, kung ikaw magsasaka, nasa baryo ka, walang pagkain. Anong gagawin mo? Wala tayong bigas. Dati tayo nag-export ng bigas. Ang gobyerno, kontra sa agrikultura. Mas maganda yung manangkali sa labas dahil may komisyon ka. Now, that is the cause of the revolution. Hunger. All the revolutions all over the world caused by hunger. That's going to happen here very soon. And the more squatters, the more the politicians bring to vote for them, the problem creates greater. And the population growth, the village is tremendous. Because the Catholics doesn't want condoms. Kalukuhan yan.
In a Filipino revolution, the big question mark is the American response to it, you know. And yet, it must be born in our minds that if we have to be truly independent, we must eschew, we must avoid being an American puppet. That kung talagang magiging independent tayo, we have to do it on our own. Yun ang malaking kamali ng New People's Army. In other words, what I'm saying is that a Filipino revolution should always be indigenized. It must be a Filipino effort, like the Vietnamese effort, you know. It should not be beholden to any nation. It should not be beholden to the United States, see? or to China. No, it should be an exclusively Philippine effort. And this is where Ka Luis and I agreed completely. He was not anti-American in that sense, but he was a true nationalist.
Lumabang kami sa Hapon dahil nasa labang kami sa pasismo, nasismo, Hitler Mussolini, militarismo ng Hapon. Tawag namin extreme evil. Kumapi kami sa Amerika, hindi dahil sa kumpleto kaming tiwala sa kanila, ngunit sila ang lesser evil. Binabasa ko mga libro ni Mark Twain, siya at ilang Amerikano, pinagtanggol tayo, ayaw niya na maging kolonya tayo. Ngunit, sa kabila noon, si Roosevelt, FDR, nangako lahat ng power, lahat ng yaman, lahat ng lakas ng aming gobyerno, itutulong namin sa inyong mga Pilipino. And help you to have complete self-determination. At babayaran namin ang mga perwisyo ninyo or damages done by the war over you. We will pay to the last chicken. Go to the last chicken. Pagkatapos ng pera, they paid me. Akong organizer. Akong tinawag na Supremo. They paid me with imprisonment. Pwede ko na forever sa iwahe sa Pilipin. Napakasakit ang ginawa sa akin. Sa aming magkakasama. Ngayon, tinanggap ko pang mabilang ko, 16 na taon. My country, right or wrong. Maski na mabilang ko dito sa bayan ko. Makikilala rin balang araw kung mamatay ako, di bale, kung mabubuhay ako sa kabila ng pagsubok na ito. Makikilala ng bayan kung sino ako.
The footages show that even in his last years, when his health allowed him, Ka Luis found the energy and the vigor to speak out his mind of the same social ills that plagued his time and continued to plague ours, consistently raging against the forces of injustice, repression, and exploitation.
Baka hindi nyo lang kayong bumubuhay sa ating gobyerno. Alam ba ninyo ang kahulugan ng indirect tax? Buwis na hindi tuwiran. Bumili kayo ng tubig. Kung nagbabayad ng buwis ito, siguro kahapat na bahagi ng tubig na itong inumin ko, dapat ibayad ng buwis sa gobyerno. Bumili ka ng sigarilyo, isang alam ba ninyo? Kung 10 piso yun, yung 4 na piso, buwis sa gobyerno. Bumili ka ng isang baril ng sabon, may buwis. Sumakay ka sa jeep, may buwis. Kumain ka sa restaurant, may buwis. Bumili ka ng pasporo, may buwis. Ano ang bilhin mo? Merong buwis. Alam ba ninyo, kung pumapasok na lahat yan, hindi. Kung sino pa yung dapat magbayad ng malaking buwis, siya pa ang tinatawag na tax evader. Magnanakaw. Halimbawa, isang inchik, dapat magbayad ng 3 bilyon. Yung 1 bilyon, panlunugol sa mga BIR, sa mga opisyal ng rentas, internas. 1 bilyon. Kaya, ibibigay naman sa mga politiko. 1 bilyon lang ang babayad sa gobyerno. Kaya sila nananatiling kontrolado nila ang negosyo sa Pilipinas. Kontrolado ng dayuhan ang negosyo sa Pilipinas. Tayo na nagpapasal sa lahat ng bis na yan, tayo pa ang lumilig daw na masama. Kapag tumutol ka, kung hindi ka mapapatay, bilang mo ka. Ay, nahihirapan ang huminga.
Indeed, Ka Luis had much to say to those who cared to listen. But it seemed there was not enough time to put it all on record. In a sense, he was a man who was running against time. And this is one of his deepest fears, that he would die even before he can pour out his thoughts, to be forgotten, to become irrelevant, a revolutionary fossil, so to speak. So here then is a virtual testament, an attempt to put him on record, perhaps for the last time.
Ang dahilan bakit hanggang mabitay si Rizal, yan ang aking pinagpapatuloy. Dahilan bakit hanggang mabitay si Jose Santos, yan ang aking pinagpapatuloy. Nagsunod, nakamulatan. Kailangan mulat tayo. Kailangan maliwanag sa ating isip. Kailangan alam natin kung ano ating ginagawa. Alam natin kung ano nakapaligid. Hindi lang dito sa ating bayang Pilipinas, kundi sa buong mundo. Alam natin ang nangyayari. Mulat tayo. Ngunit ang kamulatan yan, 3 uri, 3 sulok, triangular. Kaya tawag ko, 3 sulok na kamulatan. Ano yan? 3 yan. Kamulatang makahuring. Magmahalan tayo magkakahuring magalita. Mga mahirap. Pangalawa, magmahalan tayo bilang Pilipino. Mamamayang Pilipino. Mga bansa. magmahalan tayo bilang revolusyonaryo. Lagi nating hinahanap ang pagbabago, ang luma ay baguhin.
This is the study room of Ka Luis, which doubled as the national headquarters of the Hook Veterans Association he organized. Cramped and barely lit.
Hindi po bayang-bayang kilala pa kayo yung mga veterans. Kilala pa kayo sa...
Here, surrounded by memorabilia of eras long past gone, Ka Luis held office as a man of our time, still involved so much passionately with our times. He read newspapers avidly. He devoured information and news, keeping up to date with current happenings here and around the world, aiding his poor eyesight with a magnifying glass. He knew and followed events. His mind was as sharp as ever. He was fast and sharp with his comments on the current leadership, never one to mince his words. And did he speak in torrents. But most of the time, he talked sense. On the same table are files of poems and memoirs he left behind, drafts waiting to be edited and revised. He wrote until his death, even if his arthritic hand slowed him down in writing his experiences and ideas.
The important thing is for us to have a sense of history. Ka Luis had that. He had a sense of history. But that sense of history was rooted in the land itself. He understood the way I also understood it, that the true nationalists are the farmers, because they are close to the land. When the farmer says, inang bayan, meaning the land, alam niya ang ibig sabihin yon, malapit sa kanyang dibdib yon, because it's the land that sustains him. See, for many of us, that sense of nationalism is not there. It's amorphous. It's something floating in the air, you know. Pero the farmer lives it because it's the land that sustains him.
In this age of the internet and electronic media, in a political world which is being invaded by people from the entertainment industry, where popularity counts more than substance or heft.
Almost all our institutions are guided by personalities. See? And in that sense, Ka Luis was a great personality. Greater than all the other leaders of the Hukbalap uprising. As a matter of fact, I consider him the greatest figure of that rebellion.
A revolutionary who will always be a revolutionary. Ka Luis was a major Filipino figure who had been largely ignored by Filipinos, but whose life and ideals had inspired another great revolutionary from halfway across the globe, Nelson Mandela of South Africa. Some years ago, when our Philippine ambassador Leonidas Caday, now retired, had gone to Mandela in Pretoria to present his diplomatic credentials, the South African president had told him, quote, "Please don't praise me too much. I just followed what your own Luis Taruc wrote in his wonderful book, Born of the People," unquote. He was everyone's revolutionary. He embraced everyone, always reaching out to other people. He did not belong to any specific, narrow ideology. He was open to new ideas. He was willing to listen and to learn. So it was only fitting that 12 years after his death, Ka Luis was inducted into the nation's Hall of Heroes by the National Historical Commission. At the unveiling of a historical marker in Taruc's hometown, the executive director of the National Historical Commission of the Philippines summed up the meaning of the ceremony. Quote, "Over the course of his long life, Taruc was a nationalist and defender of the rights of farmers and workers." unquote. Belated as it was, the proclamation was deserving. Enough time has passed for our nation to welcome him to the Hall of Heroes.
Siyang gumising sa Pilipino sa problema agraryo. Ang pinagtanggol niya yung mga magsasaka, yung mga mahihirap, at tinulak niya ang hustisya sosyal, ang tunay na pagmamahal sa bayan. Tawag natin patriotismo, nasyonalismo. Ayun po ang kanyang papel sa ating buhay Pilipino. Historical contribution niya na hindi dapat mabuburayan, ano?
The ancestral home of Ka Luis used to stand here in Barrio Santa Monica in the town of San Luis, Pampanga. This is where he was born. He was the fourth in a brood of 5.
Doon nag-umpisa ho ba lahat? Doon ko unang pinuno si Commander Banal. Commander Bernardo Poblete alias Commander Banal. Yun nagkaroon ng pulong ng Umpalahap. Hindi pa Umpalahap ang pangalan.
Santa Monica is across the Pampanga River from the town proper.
Ay, linalangoy ko yan. Kung may sumasahi sa mga ilog sa bundok, hindi makasali yung kasama ko. Ay dala kami lubin na kasang lihis niya. Ako mauna. So bagay kalahati lang niya yung mga ilog sa bundok. Yung baryo ng nanay ko, San Agustin. Ito, tawag ng tatay ko, Santa Monica. Magina yun. Anak ni Santa Monica, si San Agustin. Ayon sa istorya ng simbahan Katoliko.
Ka Luis worshipped his father, a kind, humble, and soft-spoken man. He worked hard and exceeded others in the produce of his share of land. He never attended school. He learned to read and write at home. Because of that, he insisted his children should go to school and urged his wife to save every centavo to send them to school.
Kami ang pinakamalaking bahay dito before the war. Pagkatapos, iginalang ng hapon yung bahay namin. Si Valeriano Malcambong hindi ginalang, kinan yun. Kaya pinulot ng asawa yung maaari pang magamit ng mga tabla at mga yaro. Kung sino pang kababayan, siya pang naging malapit sa amin. Kung sino pa kami nakilabang pa sa bayan, kami pang pinubugutan ng ulo. Kami rin ay komunista, kalaban ng gobyerno, anti-Pilipino, anti-Amerika. Kapag nationalist ka, communist ka. Ang kalaban ng mga Amerikano noon ay si Stalin.
The Americans were always anti-communist. Mga kapitalista yan. See, they have always been anti-communist. See.
Ruperta, his mother, and Nicanor, his father, toiled on borrowed lands in San Luis and in Baliwag, Bulacan, with much of the harvest going to the warehouse of the church or of the landowner. The Taruc children had to work their way to school or skip it on years when harvest was low. It was a hard life. He rose at 5, cooked rice, then walked 5 kilometers to be at school by 7, carrying rice wrapped in a banana leaf for lunch. School never came easily for him. Eventually, he finished the 3-year intermediate course in 2 years with honors. The train ran through San Miguel and travels to and from other provinces in and out of the station. After school, he ran to grab their baggage. He was a baggage handler, a cargador. They would give him 5 centavos for his trouble. When he had completed the 7th grade in school, he told his father that he did not want to be a peasant all his life. His father was pleased, for he believed that through learning, his sons could escape the toil he had known. Little did Luis know that he would have to work so hard to get an education in the years ahead. The young Luis went from one elder sibling to another in Pampanga and Tarlac, helping out in their tailor shops to be able to finish high school. As a young peasant boy, he learned early about injustice. Every year after harvest, the young Luis watched from the dark corner of their nipahat the frustration and despair of his parents, sadly facing each other across the rough dulang, counting corn grains or palay or unhusked rice. The grains of corn represented their debt to the landlord, 1 grain for every peso they borrowed during the planting season. They produced 200 kavans of palay yearly. Every peso they borrowed was paid back with 1 kavan of palay, and 10 kavans were paid back for every 5 kavans of palay they borrowed. 5 to 7 kavans of palay were paid for each kavan of polished rice or bigas the landlord advanced for them to keep alive. The debts, of course, grew from year to year, and the corn grains were never absent from the lives of his parents. One particular incident which he could not forget until now. It happened when his father told him to sort out the corn for next year's planting season. The nuns came and carried rosary books. Pagdating ng madre, sabi nila, "Oh, ba't nyo ninanakaw mais namin?" I told myself, why do they call us thieves? It was my father and mother who planted these. Now that we are harvesting these, and they came and claimed that the corn is theirs? His father sent him off to Manila with a strict advice. Don't accept money that you didn't work for.
Gusto ko pang mabalitaan na ikaw ay namatay. Kaya sumabalitaan ko kung nagwalang hiya ka. Kaya ako nagtatagal masikisang pera. Sa ngayon ng tao, hindi mo pinagpagulan. Kaya hingin ko kay mentura, trabaho, naging time keeper ako. So may support ng pagdasisip o namasa ngayon o MWSS.
This was how he supported himself through college at the National University in Manila. After more than 2 years in college, he had a falling out with Ventura, who quarreled with Manuel Quezon over the hair hawse cutting law. Luis sided with Quezon, who was opposed to the presence of United States military bases after independence, but who ended up ironically instead with another version, Tidings McDuffie Law, which signaled unfair trade. Luis found it useless at this point to be pursuing his studies when the government seemed not to be caring enough for the welfare of the common tao. He left behind his wife Feliciana and their newly born son Romeo in Manila.
Nang mabingigan si Romeo, nagpunta na ako yung Abad Santos sa lolo Pedro mo. Diyan, nasa libro na handa mo ipailalim ang iyong personal at family interest natin. Kilusan, opo, handa kang mamatay para sa kilusan. Bakit po? Baka mapilitan tayong magrevolusyon. Eh kung darating po yun at panahon na talaga, makakaiwas na tayo. Opo. Pero isa pong pansin, bakit kayo lumaban sa Castilla at Fraile? Hindi kayo napatay. Lumaban kayo sa Amerikano, hindi kayo napatay. Baka makaligtas din ako. Pero kung hindi ako makalaligtas, talagang ganun.
Pedro Abad Santos came from a well-to-do family in San Fernando, Pampanga. He attended good schools in Manila, then returned to Pampanga to practice law. During the Revolution, he fought first the Spanish, then the Americans. During the American period, he earned a reputation as a skilled attorney, and he got elected to Congress. While in Congress, he became increasingly concerned about the troubles of Pampanga's rural folk. He became more and more aware of social injustices around him. He began to give free legal counsel to peasants and their organizations. He was labeled as a radical, and politicians dumped him from their party ticket. This led him to found the Socialist Party of the Philippines on the early 1930s. By then, he turned away from his elite background and became a prominent spokesman of several peasant groups, and decided to live an ascetic life in a small house in San Fernando, which became the office of the Socialist Party and meeting place for peasant activists and leaders. He also attracted young men who were serious about working in the peasant movement. Among them was the young Luis Taruc. Perhaps seeing leadership qualities in the young Luis, Abad Santos opened his library to him and entrusted to him the organizing of the Aguman Dareng Maldang Talapagobra, or AMT, which meant General Workers Union. One of his initial assignments from Abad Santos was to frame the constitution of the Socialist Party of the Philippines, which until that time had no constitution, although it was organized by Abad Santos way back in 1932. In the 1936 Assembly, Luis was elected Secretary General of both the Socialist Party and the AMT. But it was just a matter of time before the Socialists merged with their natural allies from the political left, the Communists.
Ang pagme-merger ng Socialist Party, ako Secretary General, Pedro Santos National Chairman, at ang Communist Party, na si Bangalisa National Chairman, si Cappadocia as Secretary General, nag-merge para magkaroon ng core of leadership na mag-produce ng National United Front against fascism, against the Axis power, and to boost nationalism and the struggle for democracy and freedom. The struggle is divided into two. As long as we are under Japanese occupation, we stick to the first decision to produce a common front, a core of unity to fight the Axis in the person of the Japanese.
On December 8, 1941, the Japanese bombed Clark Air Base. The assessment of the two parties was proven correct. The Japanese invasion of the Philippines in December 1941 provided the impetus that enabled a small number of untrained, unorganized resistance fighters to become an effective guerrilla force. Growing out of initial discussions that began in December 1941, the military wing of the anti-Japanese movement was officially formed on March 29, 1942, and called Hukbo ng Bayan Laban sa Hapon, or Hukbalhap.
Si Calvis, nang mabalitaan ako ay magre-report na. Kung may sulat na, mag-report ako sa Kalubang eh. Sabi niya, sa halip na sasama ka dyan, sumama ka na sa guerrilla sabagat nagsusurrender na mga Amerikano sa Bataan. Kaya sa halip na tumuloy ako sa Kalubang, tuloy ako sa San Fernando. Sumama ko kay Calvis, na doon ay tinatatag niya mga support battalion, support sa US Army, workers sa Pampaga. Matawali, nagpulong ang mga leader na magbubukid at saka magagawa at itinaga unang bayan laban sa Hapon. Si Calvis ang napiling chairman ng Hukbalhap. How come I was the one selected to lead the farmers and organize the Hukbalhap, which was the heir to and continued the patriotic mission of KKK and Bonifacio. That's why Mas Media called me Supremo, a successor to Bonifacio. I rejected it. I prefer to be called Calvis, Kahiken, because that is more interesting, that's more meaningful, that's more patriotic. Kabayan, kapanalig, kapatid, kasama, comradeship ang kailangan natin. Kaya ako pinili nila maging chief organizer ng Hukbalhap sapagkat I sleep there with them, I eat with them, I plant rice with them, I plant corn with them, I plant sugarcane with them. I was with them. I was the son of a peasant. I knew all the work of the peasantry, pati pangingisda.
He was able to identify more with them. You know, the Lavas were intellectuals, they were urban people, see. They were thinkers, see. Luis also did a lot of thinking. I'm not saying that he wasn't a thinker, but he had that common touch. You know, he was able to really wield himself to the masa.
Maganda magpalakad ng kilusan ang Luis. Magandang magpalakad ng kilusan. At mas marami ang nakinig sa Luis kaysa hindi nakinig sa kanya. Hanggang sana nagkaroon na brainwash na nga ang Nuevesia. Kaya almost ang mga Nuevesia na sa edad na mga panahon yun, panay Taruc yun.
After its conception in 1942, the military committee combined with CPP leadership to form the Hook General Headquarters, or GHQ. Luis Taruc served as chairman of the GHQ, with Castro Alejandrino, a former middle-class landlord and mayor of Arayat, assisting him as vice chairman. With a few trained fighters and even fewer weapons, Luis and his comrades established a base of operations in the vicinity of Mount Arayat and the neighboring Candaba Swamp.
Yung Candaba Swamp, puro kawayan. Ang daming kawayan lahat yan, dikit-dikit ng kawayan. Ang kubo nila Luis, nakadungdung yung kawayan na gano'n, nakatakip. Hindi makita ng mga aerial patrol ng Hapon. At hindi ka na makakapunta ron kung hindi ka na kabangka. Kaya safe na safe yung kanilang headquarters sa gitna ng Candaba Swamp.
Kaya yung armas nagsimula kami sa pag-ipon ng mga armas na nasa kamay na ng mga kasama. Halimbawa, mayor ng Arayat, ang lahat ng armas ng municipality Arayat, pinahawak niya. Mayor ng Mexico, mayor ng Angeles City. At sa mga armas nito, at meron pa sa tatlong Beka, dito sa Baybay, malapit sa Lubaw, Makabebe, and Basatul. Meron dyan na leader na may talaga armas na hawak sa mga Chile, mga sosyalista. Ang lahat na armas na yan ay pinagsama-sama at bawat lalawigan nagtatag ng squadron.
Ang baril ng aking masama, lalabid 5 lang baril. Noong Squadron 98, lalabid 5 lang. Pero meron na silang isang automatic rifle, saka isang garan, ang karamihan shotgun.
Anticipated namin na babagsak ang bataan. Kaya naghanda kami ng mga bangka, nagdaan sa bandang Abukay na yan, bandang gitna ng pinaglabanan, para pag sumuko ang bataan, handa kami para mamulot ng baril na iwanan sa parang. Kaya ang pasimula ng aming malakas na sandata, mga garan, mga Browning automatic, yung rifle, mga ilan-ilan, meron kaming water cool, air cool, masinggan, mga 5,000 nakakuha namin baril sa bataan. Yun malakas. Tas pasimula, kinalat namin sa Bundok Arayat, mga 500. Kinalat namin sa Nuevesia, mga 500. Pampanga, mga 1,000. Pero Nuevesia, mahusya rin mga ipon ng baril at magpalakas ng kanilang sarili. Kaya lahat-lahat, ang umpisa namin, mga 5,000 baril, nakuha namin sa bataan, saka sa mga sundalong nagsipag-surrender. Lahat na yan, pagsama-samahin mo, nagkalat yan. Pampanga, konti sa Bulacan, konti sa Taruc, marami sa Nuevesia. At yun, pag-umpisa ng aming walang humpay na pagtambang sa mga Hapon. Kaya umabot sa 20,000 ang aming baril. So nakukumpiska sa kalaban, nakukuha sa iba pang paraan ng pakikibaka. Ako napasama sa educational. Ang assignment ko, sapagkat natutuhan ko sa military, tuturo ko sa mga humalami. Hindi sila marunong bumaril, tinuro ko ng triangulation, tinuro ko sila ng squad formation, tinuro ko sila ng military formation hanggang sa battalion formation na kung tawagin ka, squadron. Ang pinakamalaking unit na humalap, mobile unit ay squadron. Kaya nagsimula kami sa squadron number 1 is Laguna and Quezon.
The 100-man squadron was the basic unit of the Hook organization. The squadron was led by a commander, an executive officer, and an intelligence officer, and was organized into platoons and squads. 2 squadrons formed a battalion, and 2 battalions made a regiment. Atop this structure sat the military committee. The recruits came largely from the AMT chapters in Pampanga, Nueva Ecija, Tarlac, Bulacan, Laguna, and Quezon. The number of fighters were between 75,000 and 100,000. About 30,000 were fully armed by guns that were left behind by the soldiers in the Bataan Death March of April 1942.
Ang unang labanan ng Hukbalahap ay nangyari sa Candaba, Pampanga na ang leader si Commander Kulala, yung Commander Dayang-Dayang. Ngayon si Dayang-Dayang nagkaroon ng personal na ambisyon na galing din sa lipunan na sa panahon ito, kung hindi ka matalino, hindi ka yayaman. Kaya palagay niya, sasamantalayin niya pagkakaroon ng lakas, power. Sapagkat nila sila nagkaroon ng power, power ang bubukid, upang kunin ang pag-ari ng mga mayayaman. Kaya siya, teorya niya, pag hindi kayo yumaman sa panahon ito, mahina ulo mo. Iyon, ang personal interest ni Dayang-Dayang, siya nang ibabaw sa kanyang interest ng pambayan. Kaya siya napailalim sa isang court-martial ng military committee ng Hukbalahap at ang pasya ng military committee ay putulin yung ganong kaugalian. Kaya naparusahan si Dayang-Dayang. Bitay.
The Hooks eventually became the most feared guerrilla group, inflicting heavy losses on the Japanese in central Luzon and southern Tagalog. Luis and his forces launched small but annoying forays from this base against the Japanese as they advanced across Luzon toward Bataan and Corregidor. As their strength and popularity mounted, the Hooks activated additional squadrons and help from an all-Chinese force, the Overseas Chinese 48th Detachment of the People's Anti-Japanese Forces, or WACHI.
Naging Squadron 48. Yun ang formation na namana namin sa mga Chinese guerrillas. At ang prinsipyo ginamit namin, fundamental spirit of the People's Army.
Bakit tawag ng 40 Squadron? Dahil como Chinese, pinapakabakanin ng Mount Zedong, dalawang Squadron ng Makaling. Isa 4 Squadron, isa 8 Squadron. Kaya ginawa kami 48 Squadron. Kasi Hukbalahap maraming Squadron yun. Hanggang tapos alam ko over 100 plus.
Yung kasama namin, puro hindi marunong salita, Kawampangan o Tagalog, mahirap eh. Ang salita lang, kwanti lang. Hindi kami pareho eh. Katulad ako galing sa Mamman, marunong ako Kawampangan, marunong ako Tagalog. Napasok ko sa elementary ng eskwela.
Yung batas ng amin, mahipit. Lalo pa kami Chinese, panahon yan, 18, 19, 20, 21, 24, pero binata pa, guwapo. Ay, bawal kami mausap sa mga dalaga o mga meron asawa o misis.
At hindi pwede ibang inisip masama. Pag meron, 5 squad yan.
Tayan, 5 squad yan.
I only concentrate in buying medicine because we need the medicine, the quinine for the malaria and for this our complex in the mountain. And I used to go every day to in the malls. I did not join the fighting squad. All the companions are fighting squad.
Isang detachment, abot ng 160. Yun talaga kami marina. Di abot kami ng 700 plus. Yun alam mo, Huachi, buong na dumalaban sa Pilipinas. Manila, Bulacan, Pampanga, Bataan, Samares, Nueva Ecija, tsaka Laguna, Bicol, meron pa dito sa Dos Baños, Batangas, Cavite, Quezon. 14 province kami na dumaman yan.
Nakita ko lang minsan nagdaan yung mga watsi. At respeto sila ng mga barangay, hindi sila hindi nanghihingi. Yung hindi nakakatakot. Ewan ko pa paano nilang binubuhay sarili nila. At meron sila sariling financing. Kaya hindi sila pabigat sa mga barangay.
Time and again, the Japanese mounted major assaults on Mount Arayat, capturing hundreds of guerrilla prisoners. Most hooks managed to slip between the Japanese lines to safety. Turning a near rout into a moral victory, the hooks drew strength and confidence from the Japanese failure to destroy their stronghold.
Naka-motorboat sila, rubberboat sila, sumalakay sa bandang Makabebe. Pinadlaan ng ating mga kasama sa pamumuno ni Commander Banal. Talagang pumula ang tubig ng ilog Kapampangan. Isa sa pinakamatlalat na bayan ng Pampanga, ang bayan ng Mexico. Tatlong naging mayor na kasama natin doon. Una si Rufino Canda, isang matapang din na kasama natin. Ang kanyang bisi, Basilio Gomez. Nang mamatay si Canda, ang nag-mayor, ang Basilio Gomez. Pangatlo, Bernal Susampang. Kaya ang bayan ng Mexico, Pampanga, isa sa pinakamatatag, matapang, nagkakaisa, na tumulong sa pakikibaka. At ang isa sa pinaka-bantog na labanan ay sa Bundok Arayat, kung saan kami nagkukuta. Tinuturo ko kami nung maglang kami sa may pagitan ng Arayat Cabyaw ay sa ekanan isa kasama natin. Ayan ang kuta ni Calves. Diyan ko nadama ang tunay na pagmamahal sa ating ng bayan. Kaya ako'y nakilaban. Ang ganda na ating bayan, pinababayaan ng mga humawak ng kapangyarihan. Kasama ko, sa tabi ko, ang isa sa pinakadakila, pinakapopular na commander na babae. Ang ama niya, nahuli ng Hapon, pinasisigaw, pinasusuko, hindi sumuko, hindi sumigaw, at pinatay siya. Ang tatlong anak niya, nagsilabas, nagpunta ng tigil-tigil sa squadron. Ngunit ang pinakapopular sa tatlong anak niya, yung pambabae. Andito ngayon kasama ko, si Commander Remedios Gomez Mrs. Parencio. Tumindig ka, kaliwayway. Nung kadalagahan yan, kapanahonan yan, isa sa pinakamagandang dalaga sa Pampanga. Naging Miss Labordale, naging Miss Pampanga. Ngunit, nung siya kumanda na babae, siya ang humawak ng 50 caliber machine gun, yung machine gun na malaki at mabigat, at hindi nakakita ng Hapon na nagre-rate sa amin sa Bundok Rayat, sa Sitio Kamansi. Mabuhay! Isilang malibaway!
Nakita ko yung parang pag nagdaan yung mga sundalo ng Hukbalahap, nagpapalakpakan sa barangay pag nang mga marcha. Parang talagang gusto nila yung guerrilla na yon na nakipaglaban sa kanilang mga kalayaan at karapatan dahil ang Hapon pag dumating, sinusunog yung mga bahay, kinukuha yung mga babae, kinukuha yung pagkain, tatakot yung mga tao.
Alam yung bahay na pulang ng mga Ilusorio, andyan sa daan, sa may Hanyatang, paglampas mo na si Miguel, papasok ka sa Alipato, may bahay na pula sa bandang kanan. Noong sinalakay namin ang munisipyo ng Candaba, at nagkalaban kami ng malaki, marami kami napatay ng Hapon, mga Pilipinong kakampi ng Hapon, doon sa laban ng Sumandili. Tinugis kami, akala doon kami nag-retreat sa Mapanike. Inipon na lahat ng tao ng Mapanike. Inipon yung mga lalaki sa may bisita, inipon yung mga babae, mga bata at matanda sa may eskwela, at saka minasaker. Yung mga babaeng 12 taong edad na pinasisimulan ng mga bukulan ng dibdib, inipon sa bayan na pula, pinagre-rape.
The Japanese in policy did not want to be brutal, but in fact, and on very many instances they were. It was the soldiers' war. It makes people pretty rough and sometimes harsh and cruel. So there were executions and rape and a number of other things like that. But in general, the Japanese official position was, take it easy on the Filipinos because we're not at war with the Filipinos. And with the internees, well, because they are civilians, let us not be accused of barbarianism. Let's not be accused of brutality. So by and large, they tried to do that, though very often they failed.
Concurrent with guerrilla operations against the Japanese, Ka Luis and the Hooks began to develop village defense forces throughout the region. These paramilitary units, called Barrio United Defense Corps, or BUDC, formed ostensibly to protect the villagers, to promote law and order, to promote anti-Japanese sentiments, and to deny the enemy access to food and supplies. Acting through the BUDC, Ka Luis established governments to run the daily activities of the villages. In 1944, Ka Luis refined Hook GHQ organization by adding subordinate departments responsible for specific functions and changed the military districts to regional commands. The expanded GHQ moved frequently around Mount Arayat and in the Candaba Swamp. Most of his effort, however, was used to press on adjacent Yusafi areas. This developed into a low-level fight for control of central Luzon between the Hooks and American-sponsored units.
Merong Amerikanong nakalimutan ko na Alan na gustong makakumpirensya mga Hukbalahap kasi yung Amerikanong yung Yusafi. Nang kami dumating sa lupang papaya noon, hindi ang Yusafi ang naging kaharap namin. Ang hinarap sa amin, panay hapon ang naging kalaban namin. Saka yung mga ganap na makahapon, yun ang naging kalaban namin. At sangayon sa Kaluis, itong mga usaping ito kinatawan din ng mga proprietaryo. Pinaglaban-laban kami ngayon ng mga proprietaryo at gusto mangyari ng mga proprietaryo, kaming mga hukbalhapi Malipols, pagkat ang alam nila ang hukbalhapi komuniste.
Just 6 days after U.S. forces landed on Leyte in October 1944, MacArthur's headquarters, GHQ Southwest Pacific Area, issued a report on the Hooks and their political ambitions, whose objective was to establish a communist regime after the United States left the islands. In southern Luzon, 2 Hook squadrons cooperated closely with the U.S. 11th Airborne Division and helped rescue American and Allied prisoners from Japanese prison camps at Cabanatuan and Los Baños. After these successful actions, members of these squadrons served as guides and interpreters while the division drove toward Manila.
Unang sumugpo sa Hukbalahap ay itong advance party ng 6th Army. Nakatagpo namin nang kami ay sumalubong sa Tarlac. Sapagkat landing kayo sa Ligayre, sumalubong kami sa Tarlac upang makausap ang leading unit ng 6th Army. Kasama sa party ng leading group na yun, ng US Army, ay si Macario Peralta, girilya ng Panay. Kasama ko na yung Apo Bio, tatay ng misis ko. Si Bio Aquino, yun ang regional commander ng, kung tawagin Reco 3, regional command number 3, at squadron number 3. Sabi sa akin ni Peralta, Peregrino, sumama ka na sa akin. Sumama ka na sa amin dahil pagdating ng army, dideserbahin kayo. Order ni MacArthur, lahat ako malahap dideserbahin. Bakit ka ako? Mga komunista kayo hindi mo ka ako nalalaman na magbubukit ko ng komunismo. Bakit sasabihin komunista kami? Yun ang warning sa akin. Sumama ka na sa akin, kundi dideserbahin kayo. At yun ang katotoo ng dumating na nga yung advance party ng US Army.
Based on wartime experience with a Hook, intelligence reports produced in the closing days of the war by the Southwest Pacific Area Staff and in collaboration with President Osmeña, who had a narrow understanding of the Hooks and their goals, MacArthur ordered the guerrillas disarmed and dispersed. It became official U.S. policy to ignore the Hooks, considering them as bands of armed civilians. During the closing months of liberation in 1945, the Americans turned against the Hukbalahap. Then, government troops began arresting Hukbalahap participants. Landlords and police victimized villagers who joined peasant organizations who petitioned for larger shares of the harvest.
Bumalik ang mga landlords na they were the traditional enemies, they were the worst oppressors of the peasantry in Central Luzon. After the war, bumalik sila sa mga haciendas nila and they were provided by the government with armed men, civilian guards ang tawag noon. See? And I wrote about this in one of my novels, My Brother, My Executioner.
Mukhang by design, talaga sila ini-encourage ng mga Amerikano upang labanan ang mga Hook. Sapagkat ang konsentrasyon ng mga Amerikano hindi Hapon kundi yung resistance group na lumalakas, ayaw nilang magkaroon ng isang grupong lalakas sa Pilipinas na magiging kakompetensya nila sa power struggle sa Pilipinas. Sapagkat ang Hook Malapay may power sa masa, kaya ayaw nilang ang Hook Malapay manatili sa picture.
In more than one instance, Hooks were confronted by armed U.S. and Philippine forces sent to carry out U.S. policy regarding the disarmament of armed civilian groups. In Pampanga, American troops surrounded 3 squadrons who refused to lay down their arms. These hooks were finally disarmed at rifle point. In mid-February, U.S. troops arrested members of the Hook GHQ and imprisoned them in San Fernando. When Taruc and Alejandrino were arrested, temporary control of the movement fell to Mariano Balgos, Hook GHQ political commissar. Balgos fled with many of his supporters to the jungles and swamps of Central Luzon and began the process of rebuilding the Hook organization. After 22 days of imprisonment, Taruc and Alejandrino were released when mass demonstrations threatened to undermine peace throughout Central Luzon. United States and Philippine government authorities hoped that the 2 leaders would convince Hooks to come in and surrender their arms. The single worst thing that the USAFE and Americans did to the Hukbalahap was the massacre of 109 Hukbalahap guerrillas in Malolos, Bulacan. Guerrillas in Squadron 77 were walking through Malolos on their way home to Pampanga.
Tatlo yun eh. Squadron 77, 87 and 97 ay kasama ng mga inchik sa Santo Tomas. Nag-liberate yung mahigit ng 2,000 prisoners sa Santo Tomas. Ang rescue ng prisoners of war sa Santo Tomas ay kamukha ng rescue ng mga prisoners of war sa Camaratuan. Pinaka-daring na rescue ng mga prisoners of war. Pero lalong daring sa Santo Tomas sapagkat mahigit ng 2,000 ito eh. Kasama dyan ng Squadron 77, 87 at 97. Na mailigtas na ito, pag-uwi na sila, itong squadron nito, na ang commander nila si Commander Sol, kinumkum sila sa, hindi sa Malolos eh, yung unang bayan before Malolos. Kinumkum sila. Pero kukuha ng armas. Ang ginawa ng Squadron 87, hindi binitaw ng armas.
Ang ginawa ng aming commander, tayo mag-fire tayo dito, huwag tayong aalis. Kung sindisermahan tayo, lalaban tayo kahit anong mangyari.
Lumayo sila, nakaharap ang kanilang armas sa mga kumukumong Amerikano. Pag sila ibinari, lalaban sila. Nakaligtas ang 87 at saka kasama nila. Itong 77 at iba pang mga kasama nito na under Sol, Commander Sol, ay binigyan ng armas. Nang makita niyo mga kasama niya ay pinaguhuli, sumakay na ng sasakyan. Nag-report na kay Calvis. Kaya si Calvis, naghabulin niya yung mga nakulong. Grupo-grupo pinapatay eh. 109 ang natandaan ko napatay nila bago tumatay si Calvis. Nilagay sa isang common grave sa Malolos. Kasama ang kapatid na dalaga ni Sol. Ni-rape at saka pinatay. Kinuha pa raw yung susi niya. Puro atrocities na ginawa ng mga Pilipino guerrillas pa. Mga usapin guerrillas sa Malolos. Mga tauhan na ni Aleo Santos.
Hindi naman ho namin alam na pinapatay yung mga kinuko eh. Ang alam namin, pinauwi na eh. Kaya, yun, wala na sa amin yung hindi kami nakuha. Ang inuna nila, yung mga opisyales. Yan ang inuna nilang kinuha. At saka yung mga babae.
Tungkol sa mga babaeng napasama sa Squadron 77, meron isang guerrillero na nakatakas. Kinuwento sa akin tungkol sa mga babae. Ang mga babae raw pag linalabas nila tuwing gabi, bago nila hinulog sa kanilang libingan, ginagaasa muna. Yun ang kinuwento sa akin ng isang guerrillang 77 tumakas. At maliban doon, hindi lang yung isang gumagasa, marami din sila.
In September 1945, the top leaders of the resistance movement formally announced the end of the Hukbalahap.
Legal na ang partido, legal na rin ang Hukbalahap noong panahon ni Osmeña.
Manuel Rojas, a politician and Army Brigadier General before the war, was a government administrator during the Japanese occupation. At liberation, Rojas, along with 5,000 others, were taken into custody by U.S. military authorities and imprisoned for collaboration. Due to his administrative skills and evidence that he collaborated to minimize violence directed against Filipinos, he was among many former government officials released on the orders of President Osmeña and General MacArthur in April 1945. The Americans called for elections. Rojas had strong support from MacArthur, and because of his administrative background was appointed to the Osmeña administration and soon returned to a position of power in the Nationalist Party, from which he challenged President Osmeña.
Napasama si Calves sa halalan sapagkat kapasyahan din ng majority. Sabi nila, tayo ba magpaparticipate sa halalan o hindi? Sabi ng mga komunista, hindi. Puppet election yan. Ang sabi ni Vicente Lama, yun ang mga Lama yan, pinaka-progressive sa mga Lama. Sabi niya, ano man ang mayroong democratic space na masasali natin, sasali tayo para ma-advance ang interest ng kilusan. Sasali tayo para yung ipinakikipaglaban natin ay malaban ng masa through the public forum, the political forum. Kaya nagpasya kami na sasali ang Hukbalahap sa pagitan ng pag-suporta sa kandidato ng Democratic Alliance. Kaya ito, Democratic Alliance, pinili si Calves at conforme naman ang mga bumukid at mga veterano nakakakandidato bilang congressman ng 2nd District.
Pagkatapos ng gera, ako'y kinumbida pa. Pinakiusapan ni Rojas, ako ang kanyang maging vice, presidente ng Pilipinas. Ibinlaw out kami sa pinakamalaking nightclub sa Rojas Boulevard, pag-aari ng Alexander, anak ng Alfonso, Sisip. Kasama ko, natatandaan ko, Commander Banal ng Pampanga, Juan Pileo ng Nueva Lital Magbabukid, sila Professor Agustin Rodolfo, Professor Gocalay ng UP, saka nalimutan ko ng iba, saka ako, galing sa Pampanga. Nung kami nagkakain na nagkukwentuhan kasama si Edgar Snow, ang mga sisip. Yung ballroom mezzanine, mga 10 meters away, ang layo sa amin. Ando si Rojas, tanong namin, nakipagsayaw ka la, Pasita de Lourdes, Conchita Sunico, nalimutan ng pangalan ng pangatlong socialite girl. Dumating ang head waiter sa mezzanine. Ito lang kapilas ng sulat. Sino po Mr. Taruc sa inyo? Ako, bakit? Ano yung Brad? Meron po sulat sa inyo. Meron po sinunod si Speaker Rojas. O nga natatanong namin, nang yung sulat. Nakita ko, Luis, will you come to my table here at the mezzanine? I want to talk with you about a very important matter. Sumulat ako sa baba. Please, you be the one to come to our table. Whatever important matter you want to talk with me. Umalis ang question. Nagbalik ulit. Nakasabi, can we meet halfway at this day? Hindi na ako makatanggi. Kami lang dalawa, walang testigo. Bahala na yung nakikinig, ang nakakabalita, kung maniwala kayo sa akin o maniwala kay Rojas. Sabi sa akin, bakit gusto mo kumakausap sa speaker? Wala akong napipiling makatutulong para magbagong buhay ang Pilipinas na talagang nakilabang para sa bayan, kundi ikaw. Ganun ba? Maganda pa lang yung presyo mo siya. Okay ka, pangalan mo yung everywhere. Kilala ka. Kaya sinasabi mo, masyado mo akong pinalalaki. Ganun din pagpapalaki, pagpapahalaga sa akin ni Rojas. Gusto niya, ako ang maging vice niya. Inisip kong mabilis ang inisip ko. Gusto niya akong magpapet katulad niya sa mga Amerikano.
hindi ko magagawa. Kung tatanggapin ko, sa pilitan, susunod ako sa gusto ng mga karton, papatayin ako ng mga kasama ko mismo. Kasi pupunta ako sa kanila, mag-report ako, sinanggap kong pwesto, sila papatay sa akin. Kapag hindi ako sumunod sa gusto ng mga karton, siya ang magpapatay sa akin, bibinta sa mga kasama ko. Ganun din ang mangyayari. Either way, kamatayan ko. Hindi ba lang kamatayan ng buhay ko eh. Kamatayan ng aking prestigyo, kamatayan ng aking dangal. Galing ako sa mahirap na magsasaka, nakagawa ko ng pangalan, dangal ng aking pamilya, dangal ng aking timbayan, dahil ng masa, ng moralita, saka ako'y pagbibili kay MacArthur. Tinanggihan ko. Kung tinanggap ko yun, ako sana ay nagpresidente ng Pilipinas sapagkat siya na heart attack, namatay habang nagtatalumpati na pinupuri niya ang mga Amerikano. Ngunit, tinanggihan ko yung kanyang anyaya. Walang kwarta na makabibili sa akin.
Sinuporta si Rojas upang magtayo ng isang puppet government. At ang hukbo ng Hapon, yung puppet army ng Hapon, siya rin ginamit ng puppet army ni Rojas nang siya umupo na sabihin niyang, I will destroy the hook in 60 days.
Tama yung ginawa ni MacArthur. Perfect puppet. He will be very useful puppet.
During the first post-war election in 1945, Rojas was elected president and 45 members of the occupation government were returned to the legislature.
Again, because of the strength of the Filipino landlord elites, they were able to ride roughshod over the Democratic Alliance.
In the interest of American imperialism, tama ang ginawa nila. They have to destroy our most base.
Accused of terrorism on the heels of violent incidents against administration candidates, Ca Luis was compelled to go back to the hills in August of 1946. Even in absentia, Ca Luis won under the Democratic Alliance, the political party formed in an attempt of some leaders of the Communist and Socialist parties to go legal.
Nang uupo na sila, nagmadyobra si Rojas na seat itong 3 senador at saka 6 na congressmen na Democratic Alliance sa charges na nag-terrorize sila, terrorism doon pa.
Kami nang ginaya, kami nang tinakot, lumapang kami at pinalitan na kami laban sa gobyerno. Self-defense lang namin. Hindi kami lumaban sa gobyerno, lumaban lang kami sa masamang pang-gobyerno. Maraming pagkakaiba nun.
Ito naman kongreso na puppet congress naman din. Inaprubahan yung suggestion ni Rojas. Kaya kung ano dikta sa kanya ni MacArthur, ginagawa ni Rojas. Nakonbin ang gobyerno, tinrabaho lang ni MacArthur yung kanyang papel na didiktahan ang gobyerno Pilipino sa magitan ng hindi tayo bibigyan ng reparation, kundi aprobahan ng Belt Trade Act, Party Amendment, Basis Agreement, yung 3 colonial laws na yun ng Amerika. Sa kabila ng binigyan tayo ng independence, pinalitan naman ng dependence.
Empty independence. Sapagkat pinilit nila ang military bases, pinilit nila ang Party Amendment, pinilit nila ang Belt Trade Act, pinilit nila ang ating mga eskwela ay supuin ang nasyonalismo at ang pagtingala sa edukasyong mga Amerikano.
It was so absurd, so conservative, that imagine that in many schools the reading of the Noli and the Fili was banned in those days. Can you imagine that? See? And almost anyone who was for agrarian reform was considered, a leftist or a rebel,
Nakasit. Ito 3 senador, kasama na rin yung tatay ni Jok, tsaka itong 6 na congressman. Pero pagkatapos na ma-seat sila, napasang Belt Trade Act, Party Amendment, Basis Agreement, at iba pa mga kasundong Amerikano. Nang mapas na yun, ibinalik sila. Binigyan pa ng back pay.
So much of our own politics was patterned after American trends upon the dictates of the Americans themselves. There was a committee of anti-American activities in the United States, which was also followed in the Philippines with the Committee on Anti-Filipino Activities.
Sinanil tayo sa kaisipang materialista na iwanan ang ating pagka-moralidad at espiritualista. Kaya ang tawag sa atin ng isang manunod Amerikano, tayo ay damaged culture. Ang ating kulturang makabayang Pilipino, ang ating kulturang tayo ay isang laing marangal at umaasa sa sarili, self-reliant, self-respecting, nawawala hanggang ngayon, lalong nasisira. Panahon ni Quirino, gusto niya maging senador ako. Alam ko ay kahinaan. Una, ako'y makikisakala sa kanila sa gastos ng partidong nasa Panginoon. Hindi ko magagawa ang dahil sa katungkulan ng sarili kong kapakanan. Pagamat wala na ako malaking panganib ay papapatay ng kalaban, papapatay lang ako ng mga tagalabas na sabi nila sila kaya iniwanan. Ang napakarami ang mga pagsubok sa akin para kayo hiwalayan, para kayo ipagbili, para kayo ay aking gamitin kasangkapan sa aking sariling kapakanan. Maliwanag ang isip ko hanggang ngayon. Hindi ako mabili ng maruming politika. Hindi ako malahuyok, malinlang ng kanilang pagkukunwari. Napakarami ang tukso na nilalapit sa akin. Niyaya ko ng mga latos, sumama sa kanya para bibigyan ako ng malaking vapor. Babae, para hindi ako may vapor, kwarta, bigyan ko sa akin kamag-anak na maiwan sa Pilipinas. Kayahin ko mag-alsa ang bayang Pilipinas. Kaya kung manalo tayo, uwi kami. Ako ang presidente ka ng Malapos. Ganon, isusubo mo kami sa patayan. Pagkatapos kung nanalo kami, ikaw ang gobyerno. I do not believe in remote control revolution. Kung talagang oras na, kami ang mag-aalsa, kami ang gobyerno. Kaya tinanggihan ko ang alok ng Malapos. Kinumbida ko ng mga laba para kumampi kay Stalin. Bullshit ka ako yung Bolshevism, Bolshevism. I do not believe in Stalin. Muntik na kami magbali lang sa mundo. Kinumbida ko ni Joe Massaysay, tinalo ko sa bilangguan. Kinumbida ko sumama sa kanya. Hindi ko tinanggap.
In 1949-53, at the height of the Hukbalaba uprising, they could have easily taken over Manila. They had Manila surrounded already. See? And there were firefights right in the city. At saka the Manila police then patrolled the city with just handguns. They had rifles and armored cars, you know. At saka nung araw na yon, when you went through Central Luzon, by convoy yan, meaning to say they had to wait for the cars to group, then with the buses, tapos there were armored cars that accompanied these convoys through Central Luzon.
By 1950, the guerrillas were approaching Manila, and the communist leadership decided the time was ripe for a seizure of power.
Si Magsaysay, siya national defense noon eh. At dala ng Amerikano, si Quirino nakiusap na mag-uusap sila para supportan ng father ko, sila Quirino, dahil nga Amerikano nakikialam na.
Si Magsaysay, number one figurehead ni Lansdale. Ang kanyang papel ay bigyang Filipino face ang American policy of colonialism.
Kaya si Quirino, nagpadala ng emisary, si Cuyugan, si Bencio Cuyugan, na gustong makipag-usap ni Quirino para tulungan siya laban kay Magsaysay. At kung mananalo si Quirino, magbibigay sila ng amnesty. Matitigil na yung butukan.
The Hooks suffered a crucial setback when government agents raided their secret headquarters in Manila. The entire Hook political leadership was arrested in a single night. At the same time, Hook's strength was dealt another blow when U.S. President Harry Truman, alarmed at the worldwide expansion of communist power, authorized large shipments of military supplies to the Manila government. Another factor in the Huk defeat was the rise to power of the popular Ramon Magsaysay. His election as president in 1953 signaled a swing of popular support back to the Manila government.
Magsaysay did not destroy the Hukbalahap uprising. You know, he may have, how would I call it, hastened, you know, its demise, but it was the Huks themselves who destroyed their organization. Naglalaban-laban sila towards the end, you know. It's the same thing that is happening now to the New People's Army. Sila mismo naglalaban-laban din. See? So, going back to my earlier statement that for all the sincerity of these people, there should be a time when they will be able to transcend their personal egos. You know.
Ang policy ng command, Central Command, intensified yung struggle within 2 years. Within 2 years, handa namin ng Quezon sa seizure of power. Halimbawa, kukunin ng Manila, kukunin ng Taruc, kukunin ng Santa Cruz. Yun ang mga plano. Para dress rehearsal, Santa Cruz at saka itong Taruc, nakakuha na ba nila, no? At yun na seize power within 2 years, hindi yan laba. Jesus laba.
What would have happened is that we would have become Vietnam. In other words, the Americans would have come here in full force, especially since meron pa yung mga American bases. See?
In 1954, Taruc emerged from the jungle to surrender, and the Hukbalahap Rebellion, for all practical purposes, came to an end. They prepared, at the request of the American military headquarters, a roster of all Hukbalahap guerrillas. The Hukbalahap did this in good faith. They gave the list to the CIC people as one of the requirements to get formal recognition for the Hukbalahap. The list was used to pick up leaders and imprisoned or killed them.
Pinatay ang leader ng mga magbubukid na si Juan Pileo sa Nueva. Sa pagkamatay ni Pileo, signal na papatay lahat at may report kay Carlos, papatay ka rin. Nagtago na si Carlos, nagtago na si Jesus Lama. Kung sila magtatago, paano marinig ng masa kanilang protesta? Ang buong organisasyon ng Hukbalahap ay nagkaisa na ang protesta ay maging organisado protesta. Tayo ay magbubuo ng isang organisasyong magtatagol sa ating pinakikipaglaban. Ito nga hukbo mapagpalaya ng bayan.
9 years ako nakabista ng rebellion. 9 years. Tapos nung nakalabas na ako, nakapiyansa na ako, biglang dumatoy, nakaupo na si Magsaysay, biglang dumatoy sa tirahan ko si Ninoy. Robbie, sabi niya, gusto mo makita ng tatay mo? Ba? Oo, ako. O, sama ka bukas. Mayroon pala siyang contact na ng negotiation. So, makay kami, pupuntang Angeles. Pagdating sa Angeles, punta kami sa bundok, dyan dito sa Porac. Nag-usap sila ng father ko. Yung mga litrato, nakasama ko noon eh. Yung litrato ng negotiation. Nung pauwi na, Calvis, anong pwede kong itulong sa'yo? Sabi niya. Sabi ni Calvis, si Robbie, paaralin mo kung kaya mo paaralin.
By 1954, the hostility between Ca Luis and Communist Party leaders deepened. That he reasons out was why he entered into an agreement with the late Benigno Ninoy Aquino Jr., then a news reporter for the Manila Times. It was, he admits, the second and last peace negotiation with the government. The first was during President Elpidio Quirino's time, which failed because officials hired Ben Ulo to kill him. Ka Luis surrendered to Magsaysay, relying on the pledges transmitted to him by Ninoy Aquino and the late Senator Manny Manahan. Instead of the preferred amnesty, he was clapped in jail.
Para pinagtaksilan siya. Kasi ang usapan, didiretso sa kay Magsaysay at palalayain. Himuking magsunod din ng mga kasamahan. Ang ginawa ay kinulong, tinapon. Kaya si Ka Luis, inisip niya nagkaroon double cross. Kaya si Loben, sinabi niya yun, di ba? Si Maximo si Loben, dinouble cross si Ka Luis, ni Ninoy.
Si Ninoy naman, wala magawa. Sapagkat maski siya babarili pagka piniteksyon na si Luis Taruc, talagang may intention ng army na eliminate si Luis Taruc.
With 26 charges against him, Ka Luis was sentenced on August 30, 1954 by Judge Gregorio Narvasa to a prison term of 12 years and a fine of 20,000 pesos. Subsequently, he received another sentence of life imprisonment on a murder charge, which was commuted to a minimum of 17 and a maximum of 20 years and an indemnity of 24,000 pesos.
Kunyan, pagkakamali, si Doña Aurora, isa sa pagkakamali niya, bakit niya sinakyan yung kotse ng asawa niya para magpunta sa baler na bahay nila. Nagdaan siya sa bungabong. Pangalawang pagkakamali ng Doña Aurora, bakit siya nagsama ng escort, 2 tarong na sundalo, isa sa unahan, isa sa uli. Sa pagkakamali niya, bakit niya sinama si Mayor Ponciano Bernardo, Mayor ng Quezon City, na kamukhang-kamukha ni Quirino sa laki, sa ugali, sa pananamit, lagi nakaterno ng shaggy skin, lagi nakasambalilo ng buntal. Kaya, akala ng espya ni Commander Viernes, akala ng espya, si Quirino ang dadaan. Tuwantid ako kay Quirino ang dedotorolan. Ito si Quirino, dadaan. Meron kami isang batalyon doon sa bundok na dadaan ng Quirino. Nag-report siya. Commander Viernes, dadaan si Quirino, andun. Nag-iinuman sila, bumibilang sa soft drink. Hindi niya kinakilala si Doña Aurora. Patambagan natin, ni Commander Viernes. Maganda itong ating pwesto. Lumakad na yung pangkat ni Doña Aurora. Tinambagan ni Commander Viernes. Napindahan niya sundalo sa harap. Napindahan niya sundalo sa likod. Nabaril sila yung 2 driver na major. Nabaril si Mayor Ponciano Bernardo. Nabaril si Philip Benjamino. Nabaril si Baby at Doña Aurora. Si General Landon nilang nakaligtas.
Ka Luis spent 14 straight years from 1954 to 1968 in a stockade, shuttling from Camps Panopio, Aguinaldo, and Crame. Finally, on June 17, 1969, Ka Luis became due for automatic release on an earlier presidential pardon. On July 1977, President Ferdinand Marcos designated him as Special Assistant on Agrarian Reform.
Pinalabas ang PD 1207. Inimplementahan ang Land Reform Program na kung tawagin niya Emancipation of the Peasants from the Bondage of Feudalism. Alam mo, salita yun. Gumagamit si Marcos ng mga revolutionary more than supportable by liberation of the farmer from the bondage of feudalism. Tsaka yung building of a new society. At pangatlo, creation of cooperatives. Yun yung mga supportable issue na sino ba sa Administrasyong Pilipino ang nanindigan para sa mga issue yun. Sinabi ni President Marcos, ako mang guerrilla rin. Kaya gusto kong ituwid, kaya this is his word. I want to correct the injustice done to you by former administrations and the American government of not recognizing you because I'm also a guerrilla. Yun ang binibigyan namin credit kay Marcos na sapagkat ginilis siya, tinila niya kapwa niya ganilya, at sinabi pa niya na itutwid niya ang injustice na ginawa ng mga past administration.
After he was released from prison by President Marcos, Ka Luis no longer had the heart for armed struggle as the way to achieve social justice and equality for farmers and the dispossessed peasants. His life was devoted to peaceful but productive endeavors that harnessed the power of collective action. His focus turned to forming cooperatives in Pampanga and Nueva Ecija, where people were receptive to his call for collective action through peaceful and legal ways. Cooperatives fitted his lifelong belief in socialism without the violent and dictatorial ways of achieving collective ends.
Nagkaroon ng agrarian reform. Nang pasimula niyan, napakaganda. Bibigay na CLT, Certificate of Land Transfer, CLT. Kapag nakapagbayad na kayong 3-4 na beses, papalitan niya ng EMP, Emancipation Patent. Yun ay garantiya na yun ay huwag ka lang magkulang ng pagbabayad, tiyak na yun na yung lupa mong sinasaka. Ngunit maging sa CLT, maging sa Emancipation Patent, bawal ipagbili ang lupa, manatiling inyo yung lupa. Hindi nyo may bebenta, pero hanggat gusto mo, habang buhay mo, andyan ka sa lupang yan. Sa amin sa Pampanga, minitingan ko doon sa mga balong katabi. Nagkabilabilang ako para makuha lang yung lupang yan. Naging inyo. Ngayong alukon kayo ng Hapon at ng Taiwanese, ng Koreano. 1 milyon kalahati bawat hektarya. Pinagbili ninyo. Ngayon nababalitan ko wala kayong makain. Pero nga kayo magandang bahay. Pero wala laman ng inyong tiyan. Itong mga anak ninyo nakahilala sa akin. At 20 batata. Anong kinabukasan ninyo? Ngayon wala na kayo lupa. May bahay kayo. Wala na kayong makain. Malungkot. Ang buhay ko inaloko sa inyo. Napalaban ako sa gera. Nakabilanggo ako sa mga bilangguan natin. Pero hindi ko kayo iniwanan. Kayo, iniwanan niyo ako. At ang lupa niyo pinabili niyo sa dayuhan. Masyado kayong nakayuko sa pera. Yung inyong karapatan na yun yung paglaban. Ako yung pinaglalaban ko. Bayaran ninyo yung 6,000 kinatas o ninakaw. Hindi ko sinasabi sa nakaw. Ang importante, kinikilala ba ninyo? May utang ang gobyerno sa ngalan ng Tibaw ng 6,000. Bawat veterano, kinatasan ng 6,000. O raw. Sabi ni Gloria, labanan natin ang karalitaan, magpakasipag tayo. Kami, dati namin ginagawa yan. Ngunit marami magpakasipag at maging maayos ang aming sipag at makatulog kami gusto sa gobyerno. Pera namin ang kailangan namin puhunan para makatulog kami gusto. Magtatatag kami ng kooperatiba. Kung walang pera ng gobyerno, maraming pera. Kung lamang sabihin ko, mayroong mahigit kulang-kulang sa 300 milyon sa ngalan ni Jose Pidal. Ang pensyon, tapos pag lumagdi na ang nagpe-pensyon. Pero kooperatiba, lalaki yan. Yung itinatag kong kooperatiba sa Nubalinsis, ngayon meron na 100 milyon. Ang puhunan, di sila ng hiram sa bangko.
Magandang tanghali po, Ka Luis. Mabuhay ang Ka Luis. Mabuhay ang Okbolap.
He lost no time in getting in touch with his former comrades in the struggle. Like Jesus of Nazareth, Ka Luis went from one barrio to another, preaching the gospel of collective ownership, calling the farmers and peasants to band together into cooperatives. Ka Luis was busy talking to cooperative members, giving counsel, listening to their problems till the end of his life. In one of his recent public appearances, he visited Nurmisuari in Fort Santo Domingo's detention center in Santa Rosa, Laguna. Ka Luis met with imprisoned Moro National Liberation Front rebel and ex-ARMN governor Nurmisuari to sign a Valentine Day of Love covenant, pledging to join our minds, hearts, and soul in the spirit of love, humbly beseeching Allah, God, to bless our aspiration for peace and national unity for the future of dear motherland and the future of our people. The rest of the text of the Love Covenant asserted, on this day, February 14, 1939, in Pampanga, President Manuel Quezon, assisted by then Secretary Jose Abad Santos, proclaimed his social justice program. Today in Laguna, birthplace of Dr. Jose Rizal, our foremost national hero, we, Nur Misuari and Luis M. Taruc, offer the remaining days of our lives to continue our quest for social justice for our people. Randy David recalls, "My father was a young attorney who prosecuted him and put him to jail. In his last years, he came to visit our home. I am no longer concerned with today's dirty politics, but in promoting love and compassion for all for the sake of our children and future generations." Ka Luis had been branded as a godless communist. But surprisingly, he believes in God. In his idea of socialist society, he believed that the laws of God are vital.
Great leader of Pampanga and the Philippines. Oh, no, I really mean it, you know. I've heard about you in books, you made history.
This probably explains why Ka Luis was never a real communist. And the more one listened to him, the more one saw Christian ideals alive in him. He was a man who had renounced material things and had devoted himself to his fellow men.
Hanggat tumitibok pa ang puso. Kapag kayo naumbila sa akin, maski na buhatin lang ako, kung maliwanag pa nga ang isip, tumitibok pa ang puso. Ang huling lakas ko, itatamay ko pa rin, iaalay ko pa rin sa pagsubaybay sa inyo na kasama ko.
Nahihina ko.
Mamaya po nahihina po. Mamaya na po.